They called her dishonorably discharged, stripped of her rank, her medals, and her reputation for refusing an order she knew would kill civilians. For 3 years, Riley Monroe stocked grocery shelves in silence while the Army's lies stood as truth. But she never stopped digging, never stopped fighting. And the day she walked back into that courtroom, in full uniform, armed with evidence that would not only clear her name, but shatter the career of the man who destroyed hers, the world would learn that some soldiers don't need a weapon to win a war. The courtroom doors creaked open, and every head turned as she walked in. Not in shame, not in silence, but with the proud, deliberate steps of a soldier who had nothing left to prove. Her dress uniform was immaculate, the rows of ribbons on her chest glinting beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. At the front of the room, the judge paused mid-sentence. Even he, who had seen decades of trials, arrests, and pleas, found himself silenced by her presence. 3 years ago, they had laughed. 3 years ago, they had pointed fingers, whispered behind hands, and stripped her of everything she had bled for. Dishonorably discharged, the words still echoed in her ears like the crack of a rifle. It hadn't mattered that she'd saved lives, that she'd followed her orders, that she'd been right. All that mattered was that someone up the chain wanted her gone. Captain Riley Monroe. She'd been known as Iron Riley in her unit. Fierce, decisive, fearless under fire. Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, her boots had touched more battlegrounds than most generals. She never flinched. Until the day she said no. It was a classified op buried beneath red tape and false reports. But the truth burned in Riley's memory like napalm. Her team had been ordered into a civilian zone, bad intel, and she knew it. A mother had stood in the road waving her arms, screaming in Pashto, and Riley had read her lips. "Children," she'd said. "Bomb." Riley had halted the convoy. The commanding officer had barked in her ear, demanding she move forward. She refused. The IED detonated minutes later, right where her lead Humvee would have passed. 2 insurgents down the road were captured alive, their confession caught on helmet cams. But the brass didn't care about the footage. They only cared that she had disobeyed. Dereliction of duty, insubordination, unbecoming of an officer. She was yanked from her command, her gear stripped, her record blackened. No court-martial, just a discharge. Dishonorable. She went home to a town that looked at her like a failure. Even her father, retired Colonel Monroe, couldn't meet her eyes. The woman who had once been saluted by battalions now stocked shelves in a grocery store. But Riley hadn't given up. She spent nights poring over the footage, the transcripts, the logs. She filed complaints, appeals, affidavits. No lawyer would touch her case. Too risky, too political. So she studied law herself. For 2 years, she worked as a janitor in a local law firm just to sit in on meetings, read discarded files, and learn from the shadows. She slept 3 hours a night and lived off instant noodles. Then she found her smoking gun. A whistleblower, a former analyst stationed at CENTCOM, emailed her after reading a blog she'd written under a pseudonym. He confirmed what she'd suspected. The operation had been buried on purpose. Her CO had falsified the mission report to protect his own career. She took it to court. They laughed again at first. A discharged captain without a law degree going up against the Department of Defense? Ridiculous. But Riley didn't blink. She represented herself. Now here she was, walking back into the courtroom 3 years after they'd cast her out. On her chest, 3 new medals gleamed. Not military issued, those had been stripped. These came from civilians. The Valor Beyond Service Medal, from a National Veterans Rights Organization, the Courage in Law Award, and the People's Star of Honor, awarded by families of soldiers whose lives she'd saved. In her hand she held a sealed envelope. The judge nodded. "Miss Monroe, do you have something for the court?" She stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor. New evidence." The courtroom held its breath as the judge opened the file. Inside were transcripts, emails, internal memos, all proving her innocence, all proving that she had saved lives. not endangered them, all proving that her discharge was not just unjust, it was criminal. The judge took a long moment before speaking. In light of this evidence, Captain Monroe, your discharge is hereby expunged. Your record will be fully restored. Furthermore, this court recommends an investigation into the actions of your former commanding officer. Gasps. A few claps. One man in the gallery stood slowly. Colonel Monroe. His eyes glistened. For the first time in 3 years, his chest swelled with pride. Outside, reporters crowded around her. Captain Monroe, how does it feel to finally clear your name? She looked past them to the flag waving on the courthouse lawn. I didn't come back to clear my name, she said. I came back to make sure no other soldier is ever punished for doing what's right. They had called her dishonorably discharged. Now they called her a hero. The headlines the next morning told only part of the story. Most of them read like apologies written too late. Wrongfully discharged hero, vindicated. Captain Riley Monroe exonerated after scandal, from disgrace to glory. But Riley didn't need headlines. She hadn't come for public sympathy, and she wasn't interested in fame. She only wanted justice, and maybe, just maybe, peace. Still, her phone buzzed nonstop. Old friends, former teammates, even strangers from other branches reached out. Some wanted to congratulate her. Others quietly wanted help. Stories poured in. Soldiers railroaded, whistleblowers silenced, careers ruined for doing the right thing. Her inbox overflowed. She didn't ignore a single one. By the end of the week, she'd already founded a nonprofit, Valor and Truth. Its mission: defend and protect service members wrongfully punished by the very institutions meant to honor them. Riley used the settlement money from the Department of Defense lawsuit to fund its first year. She didn't even cash the check personally. Every cent went back into the cause. But something else happened, something quieter, that meant even more to her. The first came in the mail, a tattered envelope with no return address. Inside was a single dog tag and a note. You saved my boy. He was in that convoy. We never knew what happened. Now we do. Thank you. More followed. Dozens, then hundreds. Dog tags, letters, photos, a locket, a folded flag. One night, as she sat alone in her small office above a former garage she'd converted into the Valor and Truth headquarters, Riley lined up the dog tags on her desk and realized they weren't just tokens. They were stories, proof, voices that had been silenced until now. She stared at them long into the night, then began writing. Not a press release, not a speech, a book. Each chapter would be a voice, a soldier, a story. She didn't change names. She asked for permission. They gave it gladly. The book published 6 months later under the title Dishonorably Discharged. Until They Fought Back. It went viral within weeks, became required reading in ROTC programs, and even made its way to Capitol Hill. Suddenly, politicians were asking questions. Hearings were scheduled. Retired generals were called in for testimony. The Army Inspector General's office reopened dozens of cold cases. Reinstatements began. Apologies were made. Some even came in person. Riley sat in the front row of every hearing she was allowed into, her presence a reminder that truth, once buried, still had roots. But the story didn't stop there. One day, while leaving a veterans conference, Riley found a familiar face waiting outside the hotel. Major Vincent Hale, her former CO, the man who had given the illegal order, the man who had written the lies that nearly destroyed her life. She froze. He didn't. He walked right up to her, his uniform stripped of rank, now just a civilian in a pressed shirt with trembling hands. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Riley studied him, not with hatred, not even with anger, just long, cool silence. You lied, she said. I did. You ruined lives. I know. Why are you really here? He hesitated. Because I couldn't sleep until I saw you face to face. Because my daughter asked me once if I was a good man and I didn't know what to say. Riley didn't forgive him. Not then. Maybe not ever. But she did something harder. She nodded once, turned, and walked away. Because some battles aren't worth fighting twice, but others are. Years passed. Valor and truth grew. Riley spoke at West Point, the Naval Academy, even testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee. Each time she did, she wore her old uniform, not for herself, but for the ones still fighting to wear theirs again. One morning, she opened the mail to find a formal letter, sealed with the Department of the Army insignia. She unfolded it slowly. Dear Captain Monroe, in recognition of your extraordinary service to the nation, both in uniform and in civilian life, the Department of the Army hereby upgrades your discharge status to honorably discharged with distinction. Attached was a silver pin, rare, reserved only for acts of exceptional merit. Below it were 4 words etched into the certificate: Justice, Service, Honor, Legacy. She pinned it next to her other medals, not above them, not below, but beside them. Equal. Earned. Riley stood in her office, surrounded by artifacts of pain, survival, and redemption, and for the first time since that convoy 3 years ago, she allowed herself a small smile. They had tried to bury her under lies. They had tried to strip her of everything. But she had come back, with 3 medals and a judge. Her smile faded the moment she looked at the newest case file on her desk. A young Marine, dishonorably discharged for abandoning post during a firefight in Iraq. Except the logs showed he had run, not to escape, but to pull an injured comrade to safety through a hail of gunfire. His CO had filed the report from a safe position miles away. Riley could already see the cracks forming. She picked up the phone and dialed. This is Captain Monroe, Valor and Truth. I want to talk about Private First Class Jamal Bennett. A pause. Then a voice on the other end replied cautiously, He's been discharged. There's nothing to talk about. There's always something to talk about, she said, her voice like a slow-building storm, especially when you've buried the truth. She didn't wait for a response before hanging up. By the end of that week, her team, now 6 strong and growing, was in contact with Jamal. They uncovered helmet cam footage, eyewitness statements, and a second report that had mysteriously gone missing. Within months, Jamal Bennett's discharge was overturned. He didn't just get his honor back, he received the Silver Star. At the ceremony, he refused to speak. Instead, he stepped back and let Riley take the podium. I didn't earn this medal, she said, her voice steady, but I will keep showing up for those who did. The room erupted in applause. After the ceremony, a young cadet approached her, nervous, barely 20, eyes wide. Captain Monroe, I read your book. I joined because of you. Riley shook his hand. Then do better than I did, she said. Stand up faster, fight harder. Don't wait until you've lost everything to find your voice. He nodded, and she saw it in his eyes. A spark. She'd seen that look before, in the mirror years ago, when everything had been taken from her but her will to fight. The years went on. Riley never stopped. Her office expanded. She brought on veterans, legal aides, journalists, even tech experts who could pull deleted files from corrupted drives. Together, they became a force. By year 5, Valor and Truth had helped overturn over 200 wrongful discharges. By year 7, that number doubled. She was nominated for the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She declined it. I didn't do this alone, she told the press. I don't need a medal for doing what our system should have done in the first place. Still, when the president called personally, Riley agreed to visit the White House, not for recognition, but to hand-deliver a list of names, soldiers still waiting, still silenced. That list sparked an internal Pentagon investigation, which led to one of the largest institutional reforms in modern military history. Discharge review boards were overhauled, independent oversight committees were formed, and at last, whistleblowers had protection. Through it all, Riley never stopped wearing her uniform to court, not because she had to, because it reminded everyone that honor isn't granted, it's earned, and it can be stolen, but it can also be reclaimed. She didn't return to service, didn't climb the ranks. She didn't want power. What she wanted was something bigger. Truth. She got it. One soldier at a time. And though they had once called her dishonorably discharged, The nation would remember her by a different name entirely. Captain Riley Monroe, defender of the disgraced, hero of the forgotten, and to those who knew her best, justice in uniform. The 10th anniversary of Valor and Truth brought more than just headlines and ceremonies. It brought ghosts. Riley stood at the edge of a memorial wall recently erected just outside the Foundation's new headquarters, a sprawling, sleek structure filled with case files, legal teams, and a growing museum of military justice. The wall was made of dark granite, polished so smooth it reflected every visitor's face back at them. But Riley wasn't looking at herself. She was looking at the names. Hundreds etched into the stone, names of veterans who never got their redemption in time, names of soldiers whose cases arrived too late. The wall was not a symbol of defeat. It was a promise. "Never again," Riley whispered. A woman in civilian clothes stepped up beside her, tall, dark hair, sharp eyes. She didn't speak, just placed a hand on Riley's shoulder. It was Grace Alvarez, her first legal hire, a former JAG officer turned activist. Grace now led the Foundation's legal division and had argued more cases before military tribunals than anyone alive. "We just got another call," Grace said quietly. "A Navy medic, same story, different uniform." Riley nodded. "We take it." "You sure? You haven't slept in days? You missed your own award ceremony last night?" "I'm not doing this for awards," Riley said. "I'm doing this so she doesn't become a name on this wall." They walked back inside. The halls were lined with flags, American, Marine, Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, but not as decoration. Each flag had a plaque beneath it telling the story of someone they'd helped. Each one had been folded away in disgrace. Now they flew again. A new recruit, barely 21, rushed up to Riley holding a thick folder. "Captain Monroe, we found something," he said breathlessly, "in the Bennett file. His CO, the same one who lied, he was part of another case in 2012. Similar pattern." Riley took the folder, scanning the contents. Her eyes narrowed. "Find the soldier's name. Track their family. If he's still alive, we get him in. If not, we clear his name." The recruit hesitated. "Captain, this could implicate a general. You sure you want to poke that nest?" Riley looked up, fire rekindled in her gaze. "We don't poke nests," she said. "We burn them down if there's rot inside." Another battle. Another truth buried. But that's what she had become, a digger of graves and a lifter of names. Every lie she uncovered was a soldier pulled back from the edge of history's abyss. That night she stood on the rooftop of the building, watching the city below, its lights, its movement, its ignorance. Somewhere out there, another veteran sat alone, shamed, broken, forgotten. Somewhere out there, another Riley Monroe was being silenced. She made a call. "Get me a flight to Texas tomorrow morning. I want to meet this Navy medic myself." She hung up and looked at the stars. Her body ached. Her eyes burned. She had scars both visible and buried deep in places no one would ever see. But she had one thing that never dulled. Her purpose. She slept 4 hours, packed her bag, and left before sunrise. The plane touched down in Houston, where the medic lived. Maria Chen. Discharged 2 years ago for conduct unbecoming. Translation: she reported a superior officer for assault. Her report was shredded, her evaluations mysteriously downgraded, and she was dumped from the service like trash. But Maria hadn't quit. She volunteered in ERs, stitched up homeless veterans, and had a room full of commendations that never made it to her official record. Riley met her in a diner off I-45, the same kind of greasy spoon that used to be her refuge before her world burned down. Maria was nervous. She clutched a manila envelope like it held her soul. I didn't think anyone would believe me," she said. "I've read your file," Riley said, sipping burnt coffee. "I don't just believe you. I believe you were targeted." Maria's eyes filled. "What do I do now?" "You let me fight," Riley said. "And if I win, you fight for the next one." And Maria did. Her case went to court. The officer she accused was exposed, disgraced, and discharged. Maria's name was restored, her license reinstated. She now ran Valor and Truth's West Coast Medical Advocacy Division. One name saved, one step forward. But Riley never let herself celebrate for long. The weight of the wall outside her office never left her shoulders. Years passed. She grew older, slower. Her knees ached from years of forced silence and marching forward anyway. She had no spouse, no children. The mission had consumed everything else. She didn't regret it. One evening, well into her 60s, she returned from a congressional briefing and found a letter waiting on her desk, handwritten, no return address. She opened it. "Captain Monroe, you don't know me, but you saved my father's life. He used to talk about you like you were a general or a saint or both. He kept your book on his nightstand. He died last year, but I wanted you to know. He died with his honor back. Thank you. Always, Thomas Wainwright, Jr." Riley sat for a long time after reading it. The next morning, she handed Grace something, her resignation letter. "I'm not quitting," she said. "I'm making space for the next soldier to carry this torch." Grace tried to protest, but Riley smiled. "You'll do better than me. You already are." She moved to a small cabin in Montana, quiet, remote, no phone, no cameras, just the sound of wind through pine and the knowledge that her name no longer bore the shadow of disgrace. But every once in a while a stranger would find the cabin, always young, always nervous. "Are you Captain Monroe?" She would nod, invite them in, listen, guide. And when they left, they carried something with them, strength not their own, a legacy, because once they had called her dishonorably discharged. Now they called her something else. The woman who never stopped marching. One brisk autumn morning, years after she'd stepped away from the day-to-day fight, Riley stood on her porch cradling a mug of black coffee, watching the fog roll off the trees like ghosts retreating into memory. She still rose at dawn, still folded her clothes with military precision, still polished her boots even if they were just for hiking now. Old habits, like old battles, never quite died. She no longer wore the uniform, but its memory clung to her like a second skin. The quiet had suited her these past few years. A few letters here and there, occasional visits from young lawyers or soldiers seeking wisdom. But for the most part, she kept to herself. Until the letter arrived, hand-delivered, Department of Defense seal. She opened it slowly, her fingers tracing the embossed emblem. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. They were reopening a case, not just any case. Her case. The department had quietly initiated a full review of the discharge process for all service members over the past 50 years, spurred by the movement she helped launch. As part of that effort, they were not only overturning wrongful discharges, they were posthumously awarding medals that had been denied. And they wanted Riley to testify before a special military tribunal to tell her story again, in full, on record, for history. It wasn't just symbolic, it was legacy. She didn't hesitate. She flew to D.C. alone, no escort, no entourage, just the weight of her name and the history it carried. The tribunal was held in a new hall, built for transparency, with glass walls and digital displays showing footage, documents, timelines. Her face flashed on screen next to headlines, old photographs, even clips of her standing in courtrooms across the country. The audience was a mix of generals, legislators, veterans, cadets. But it was the front row that caught her eye. Several of the soldiers she had helped, Maria Chen, Jamal Bennett, Thomas Wainwright, Jr., dozens of others, each wore a pin that said V&T, Valor and Truth. She took the stand. "My name is Captain Riley Monroe," she began, "and I was wrongfully discharged from the United States Army for doing the right thing." She told everything, not just the missions, not just the betrayal, but the silence, the shame, the nights she almost gave up, the moments of doubt, the isolation. "I was made to feel like a traitor because I followed my oath, to protect life, to uphold justice, even when it was inconvenient, even when it embarrassed people with stars on their collars." The room was dead silent. She ended with a simple statement. "I didn't fight to be a hero. I fought because I couldn't live with being a coward." When she stepped down, the entire room rose to its feet, not clapping, saluting, even the generals. Afterward, they presented her with a final medal, a custom honor created in her name, the Monroe Star for Military Integrity, a rare distinction to be awarded to service members who demonstrated extraordinary moral courage in the face of institutional opposition. She accepted it quietly, tears threatening but never falling. "This isn't mine," she said. "It belongs to everyone who ever stood up and was knocked down for it." When she left the tribunal hall, news cameras tried to catch her for interviews, but she slipped out a side door and disappeared into the crowd like she'd never been there. That night, in her quiet cabin, she placed the Monroe Star in a box, not on a mantle, not framed, just wrapped in the letter that summoned her to testify. Then she sat down to write. Not a speech, not a case file. A letter. To the next soldier. There will come a day when your truth costs you more than you thought you could afford. Speak it anyway. There will be a time when your courage isolates you. Stand anyway. There will be voices telling you to forget it, to move on, to shut up. Remember anyway. And when you feel alone, remember me. Not because I was perfect, but because I wasn't. And I kept fighting. She printed 10 copies, sent them to every military academy in the country. One ended up in the hands of a young cadet at Fort Benning. She read it every night. When she graduated, she requested to be assigned to Valor and Truth's legal division. Legacy had a new name, a new voice, a new torchbearer. Riley spent her final years in peace. Fishing, reading, sometimes getting calls from Grace, who now ran an international branch, or Maria, who opened trauma centers for female veterans, or Jamal, who became a senator. Each call brought pride, quiet pride. She never posted about it, never bragged, just listened. Then, one spring evening, the sun slipped behind the mountains and Riley Monroe didn't wake up. There was no grand announcement, no funeral parade, just a letter mailed to the Valor and Truth office a week later. Typed, unsigned, likely from Riley herself, scheduled by her lawyer. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't stop. Don't cry long. And don't you dare waste time naming a building after me. Use that money to hire a damn good lawyer for someone who needs one." They honored her last wish, almost. But they did place a small plaque outside the original Valor and Truth headquarters. It read, "She was called dishonorably discharged, but history called her something else. Riley Monroe, soldier, fighter, truth-teller, justice in uniform." And across the country, every time a wronged veteran took the stand, every time a soldier stood tall against injustice, every time a truth was told that power tried to bury, her story stood behind them, unflinching, unbroken, unforgotten. 10 years after her death, on the anniversary of her first courtroom victory, a memorial gathering was held at the original diner off I-45, the same one where she'd met Maria Chen all those years ago. The place had changed little. Still smelled like burnt bacon and coffee, still had vinyl booths with cracks sealed in duct tape. But tonight it was full, standing room only. Veterans from every branch had shown up, lawyers, judges, journalists, and, most importantly, soldiers who had once believed their voices didn't matter. Each of them owed something to Riley Monroe, even if they'd never met her. Grace Alvarez stood at the front holding a yellowed folder, the original discharge papers Riley had once carried to court, now sealed in a glass case. "We don't gather to mourn her," Grace said, her voice steady, her presence nearly as commanding as Riley's had once been. "We gather because her fight didn't die with her. It passed to us." She nodded to a young man in dress blues, Lieutenant Theo Garner. He stepped forward holding a box. Inside was a worn military cap, Riley's. He turned slowly, looking across the crowd. "I didn't know Captain Monroe personally," he said, "but because of her, my mother's discharge was overturned before she passed. Because of her, I got to believe in the uniform I wear." He placed the cap in the glass case next to her discharge papers. Silence followed, not the awkward kind, but the sacred kind. After the ceremony, people lingered, sharing stories. A grizzled Marine who had never cried before stood in the corner, openly weeping. A young female soldier carried a copy of Dishonorably Discharged until they fought back, dog-eared and highlighted. Later that evening, back at Valor and Truth headquarters, a teenager stepped off a bus. Alone, just a backpack and a sealed envelope. She walked up to the front desk and placed the envelope down. "I'm looking for someone who can help me." The receptionist opened it, read the summary, and quietly handed it to Grace. The file was eerily familiar. Different details, same pattern, same silence. Grace didn't hesitate. "Let's get to work." The war Riley had fought was no longer a lone battle. It had become a movement, a doctrine, a promise. Across the country, a new generation rose through the ranks, officers who had Riley's story as part of their ethics training, recruits who quoted her speeches, commanders who thought twice before ignoring reports. In Washington, her name appeared in legislation. The Monroe Act, a bill mandating third-party review for all dishonorable discharges. It passed unanimously. Her face, once absent from military halls, now hung in the National Veterans Museum, not in the Heroes Wing, in the Reform Wing. Her plaque read, "She didn't change the rules, she changed the game." But it wasn't just the military she impacted. Civilian courts began citing her cases as precedent in corporate whistleblower suits. Schools taught her story alongside Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman. Law students argued mock trials based on her original defense. Still, her legacy remained humbly rooted where it began, in voices that had once been silent. At a small high school in rural Indiana, a student gave a speech for Veterans Day. She was 15, nervous, clutching a note card. "My dad was once called a liar for telling the truth. They took his rank, his home, and almost his life. But someone stood up for him. She didn't even know him. She didn't have to. She just believed that honor should never be silenced." The girl paused, her voice cracking slightly. "That's why I want to be a lawyer, so maybe someday I can be like Captain Riley Monroe." The gym went quiet. Then everyone stood, not clapping, saluting. Because 10 years after she was gone, Riley Monroe still marched. In courtrooms, in classrooms, in boots she never saw, in voices she helped find. Not every war ends in peace. But some leave a legacy louder than gunfire, stronger than silence, and more enduring than medals. She was once called dishonorably discharged. Now she was something else entirely. Immortal. 25 years to the day after Riley Monroe took her final breath in that quiet Montana cabin, a statue was unveiled. It wasn't made of bronze or marble. It wasn't towering over a battlefield or standing on Capitol Hill. It was tucked behind a modest brick building in the heart of Chicago, the new headquarters of Valor and Truth. Smaller than their sprawling D.C. campus, but more personal. It sat on the very block where Riley had once worked as a janitor, listening to lawyers through office vents, soaking in every legal term, every strategy, every injustice she vowed one day to undo. The statue depicted her not in uniform, not in a courtroom, but sitting on a bench, hands folded over a thick file folder, eyes fixed forward with a quiet resolve. There was an open space beside her, an invitation to sit, to listen, to remember. Etched at her feet were the words, "Truth never needed permission." People came from everywhere to visit. Some left flowers. Others left worn dog tags, folded letters, medals they'd once thought would never be returned. But it wasn't just a place for mourning. It was a place of motion. Next door to the statue sat the Riley Monroe Institute for Military Ethics and Justice, a state-of-the-art facility offering legal training, therapy for discharged veterans, housing assistance, and most importantly, a platform. Every year, the Institute awarded the Monroe Scholarship to 5 young veterans who planned to pursue law. The criteria weren't based on GPA or physical fitness. The only requirement, a moment in their lives when they stood up for what was right, regardless of consequence. At the scholarship ceremony that year, a tall woman in full navy dress blues stepped up to the podium. Her name? Commander Maria Chen. She adjusted the microphone and smiled gently. 25 years ago, I met Riley Monroe in a roadside diner. I walked in with a manila envelope and more fear than hope. She looked me in the eye and said, "Let me fight." That moment changed my life. And today, I don't just wear this uniform for my country, I wear it for her. She paused, then turned to the crowd of scholarship recipients seated in the front row. Riley believed that integrity doesn't retire, it doesn't discharge, it doesn't bend when the pressure rises, it rises with it. She gestured to the seats. Now, it's yours. Applause echoed through the hall, not raucous but grounded, like thunder rolling over land that finally knew peace. Outside, a child sat beside the statue, her feet not quite touching the ground. She wore an oversized hoodie with V and T stitched across the back. Her father, a former Air Force intelligence officer, knelt beside her. "She's the reason I'm here," he told her. "She looks kind," the little girl said, reaching out to touch the statue's hand. "Was she nice?" The father smiled. "She was fair. She was strong. She was relentless. And yeah, I think when she needed to be, she was kind too." They sat there a while, watching the sun set over the quiet courtyard. Inside the institute, workers bustled, reviewing files, calling clients, preparing cases. Riley's portrait hung in the central atrium, not the young captain with the hardened jaw, not the grizzled fighter in the courtroom, but a middle-aged woman in a simple jacket, holding a coffee cup, eyes calm but sharp. She didn't look like a hero, that was the point. Because Riley Monroe had always been just a soldier, a woman, a voice that refused to be silent. And in being ordinary, she'd become unforgettable. The world had called her dishonorably discharged. Then they called her hero. Then legend. And finally, they called her what she always was, right. On the 100th anniversary of Valor and Truth's founding, the world remembered Riley Monroe not just as a soldier or a legal warrior, but as one of the few people who had reshaped the very fabric of how honor was defined. By now, her story had been told in documentaries, classrooms, biographies, and even a feature film, Steel in Silence, which swept awards not for its drama, but for how closely it stuck to the truth. The real truth, the kind Riley never let anyone rewrite. But no retelling ever quite captured her essence like the living legacy she left behind. At Valor and Truth's Centennial Gala, representatives from more than 30 countries were present. What had started as a single phone call in a dusty diner decades ago had grown into a global coalition for justice, supporting wronged soldiers and whistleblowers in militaries around the world. Offices stood in London, Tokyo, Cape Town, and Rio. Each one bore the same motto etched into its walls: truth never needed permission. The night's keynote speaker was a young woman named Amari Rowe, a cadet turned lawyer turned director of the Monroe Global Initiative, a branch focused on uniting international human rights with military accountability. She took the stage with a worn journal in her hands, Riley's. 50 years ago, she said, Captain Riley Monroe wrote, "Maybe I won't be around to see the final fight, but if I've done my job right, it'll be a fair one." She paused, letting those words settle. Tonight, I want to read you an excerpt that never made it into the book. It was scribbled in the margins, dated just weeks before her passing. She opened the journal. If someone finds this, if you're reading it, just remember, no uniform, no rank, no branch ever mattered more than the truth. If they try to bury it, dig. If they try to shame you, stand. If they tell you your voice is too small, speak louder. And if you ever think you're alone, you're not. I'm still here. In every courtroom, in every quiet act of defiance, in every soldier who refuses to lie for the sake of comfort, keep fighting, because they won't see you coming, but they'll feel you when you land. The room was silent. No applause, not yet, because no one wanted to break the spell of her words. Then Amari stepped aside and gestured toward the stage's massive screen. One by one, the faces of veterans from the last century filled the screen. Soldiers who had once been branded as failures, frauds, criminals, now reinstated, honored, and remembered. Each face was a chapter Riley had helped rewrite. The final image was not of Riley herself, but of a folded American flag with a single medal placed on top of it. The Monroe Star for Military Integrity. Since its creation, it had been awarded only 22 times. Every recipient had faced institutional pressure to stay silent. Every recipient had stood anyway. And now a new recipient was being honored posthumously. A quiet man named Riley Monroe, Riley's younger brother, a Navy linguist who decades earlier had leaked evidence of war crimes to Congress and paid the price in silence and solitude. Riley had never spoken of him publicly, but his records were discovered among her files years after her death, alongside notes, appeals, and letters Riley had never stopped writing on his behalf. The final act of the gala was Elias's reinstatement and recognition. It was Grace Alvarez, now retired, frail, but still sharp, who stood with trembling hands to accept the medal on his behalf. She looked out at the crowd, smiled, and said, "She kept fighting for him even when no one else would. That's who Riley was." As she stepped down, every person in the room rose. This time, not in salute, not in applause. They simply stood, because that was how you honored Riley Monroe, by standing. Afterward, the crowd poured into the museum wings of the new Valor and Truth complex. Some lingered by her uniform, sealed behind glass. Others sat beside the old bench statue now replicated worldwide. But in the farthest wing, away from the displays and speeches, was a small room with no fanfare. Just a desk, a file cabinet, and a rotary phone, recreated exactly from the original diner where Riley made the first call. The plaque outside the door read, "Justice started here, so can you." Every visitor before leaving had the chance to pick up that replica phone and speak into it, not connected to any line, not recorded, just a symbolic act, a promise, a beginning. Thousands had done it, each one repeating the words that launched the movement, "Son, now." And with that, Riley Monroe lived on, not as a legend to be admired, but as a command to be followed. So they kept marching, they kept digging, they kept speaking, and through every act of courage, no matter how small, she never stopped returning. In the decades that followed the centennial, Riley Monroe's name was no longer just history. It was doctrine. Military academies around the globe taught the Monroe Method, a legal and ethical framework emphasizing truth, soldier advocacy, and resistance to unlawful command. New recruits learned about the chain of command not just as a structure of obedience, but as a moral responsibility. Your orders end where your conscience begins, one Monroe Method lecture opened, repeating a phrase Riley had once scrawled in the margin of a discharge appeal. In the vast library of the Monroe Global Institute, volumes of overturned cases, restored ranks, and cleared names lined the shelves. What had once been buried, sealed behind redactions and shame, was now public, preserved, and taught. But change didn't stop there. Valor and Truth, in its second century, partnered with artificial intelligence researchers to create a tool called Sentinel Monroe, a watchdog system used by global military institutions to scan discharge files for patterns of abuse, misreporting, or discrimination. The system flagged anomalies in real time, and human rights lawyers received alerts with full data packets. It became illegal in many nations to process a discharge without a clean Sentinel scan. In other words, the future now fought back. And at the heart of it all remained one unshakable story, Riley's. Her portrait became an international icon, not heroic or grand, but raw. Her eyes serious and tired, her hair pulled back. A small scar visible near her temple from a training accident never recorded. Beneath every portrait, wherever it hung, the same quote appeared: "The truth outranks all of us." In popular culture, her influence surged again, not through more movies or books, but through a revolutionary legal drama titled Code 44, Monroe. The show didn't fictionalize her. It followed a team of young military lawyers operating under her legacy, solving real cases pulled from the archives of valor and truth. Each episode began with a narration from Riley's writings, voiced by an actor but ending with her actual words. The final season, aired globally, showed a fictionalized trial that mirrored Riley's first tribunal victory, and ended not with applause, but a single moment of silence as the characters placed her old cap on the judge's bench. Viewers all over the world stood at that final scene, because that cap no longer represented disgrace. It represented revolution. Back in Chicago at the Monroe Institute, an elderly janitor named Bernard Osei locked up the exhibit halls every night. A Ghanaian immigrant, former RAF engineer, and quiet war historian, Bernard had once been the recipient of Monroe's support after a NATO tribunal unfairly discharged him for refusing to falsify reports. Riley had fought for him personally, spent weeks reviewing documents, appearing via video from her cabin in Montana just to testify. After his case was overturned, he asked what he could do to repay her. She smiled through the monitor and said, "When I'm gone, keep the doors open." So he did. Every night Bernard walked the same path, past her uniform, past her cap, past the replica diner booth, and finally past a wall that had grown longer with every year, the wall of the redeemed. Each name etched on it represented a veteran whose discharge had been overturned. It now spanned 5 walls, over 10,000 names. At the center, Riley's name glowed slightly brighter, not in vanity, but because her inscription was interactive. Visitors could place their hand on it and listen to audio clips pulled from her hearings, interviews, and even letters. Bernard pressed his palm to it one evening. Her voice, soft but unwavering, played, "You don't have to be loud to be heard, just be true, every time, that's enough." Outside, as storm clouds gathered over Chicago, a young woman stood beneath the statue of Riley Monroe, backpack soaked from the rain. Her name was Noor Saif, a Jordanian-born former Army medic turned lawyer who had traveled across the world just to see where it all started. She sat on the bench beside the statue, dripping, tired, but smiling. She pulled out her laptop and opened a case file. A young Afghan interpreter discharged without cause. No one was helping him. No one believed him. She whispered under her breath, "Let me fight," and began writing the appeal. Inside the institute, the lights dimmed, but the statue stayed lit. Because the truth didn't need applause, it didn't need a uniform. It only needed one thing, someone to carry it forward. Riley Monroe's story never ended. It was still being written, one name at a time. On the morning of Valor and Truth's 125th anniversary, long after Riley Monroe's name had become more movement than memory, a letter was discovered buried deep in the original headquarters foundation. It was found during a renovation behind the drywall of her old office, now a shrine. A construction worker clearing out a section for a new accessibility ramp struck something solid behind a plaster panel. It wasn't much, just an old metal strongbox, rusted at the hinges, sealed tight with an old army padlock. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with twine, was a letter in Riley's handwriting. It was addressed simply, "To the one who comes next." By then there had been thousands of nexts, soldiers, lawyers, students, rebels, all who carried the torch she first lit. But something about the letter felt intimate, direct, as if Riley had known this moment would come. They gathered a team of historians and curators, and in a private conference room under heavy security, they opened the letter. The paper was yellowed, the ink slightly faded, but her handwriting remained clean, deliberate. To the one who comes next, if you're reading this, it means the fight is still going. Good. That means we didn't win it completely, and I never expected we would. Justice isn't a door you walk through once. It's a hallway, long, winding. Sometimes the lights go out, sometimes the floor caves in. But you walk it anyway, you crawl it if you have to, because somebody has to. I wrote this not as a command, not as a burden, but as a reminder that even if they strip your stripes, your rank, your name, they can't touch the truth you carry. That's yours, always. You're going to lose people. You're going to lose time. You're going to question why the hell you ever stepped up. But remember this, when they try to silence you, it means you're loud enough. When they try to bury you, it means you're standing where it hurts them. When they call you dishonorable, check their record first. You might think I was brave. I wasn't. I was tired. I was angry. I was cornered. Bravery just happened to be what was left after everything else was taken. Use what you've got. That's enough. And if you ever doubt that one voice can change a system, look around. You're standing in the place that proved otherwise. Now go. Kick the door in. Write the truth. Fight for the silenced. And if all else fails, call the Army. They already know your name. RM. The letter was scanned, preserved, and enshrined in a titanium glass case in the new Valor and Truth World Hall, surrounded by quotes, artifacts, and letters from those who'd followed in her footsteps. It became tradition for every new staffer, intern, and volunteer to read Riley's letter on their first day. But one person in particular took it to heart more than anyone else. Maya Kinsley. She was only 29. A former Air Force cyber intelligence analyst wrongfully discharged after exposing a series of illegal data manipulations that inflated drone strike accuracy reports. Her story had already gone global, and she'd won back her record in record time thanks to valor and truth. But what made Maya different was what came next. She didn't just stay to work with the Foundation, she changed it. Maya launched the Monroe Vanguard, a rapid response unit of lawyers, digital forensic experts, and translators, who could mobilize in less than 48 hours to any region where a discharge was in question. They operated globally, quietly, and with terrifying efficiency. What Riley once did with phone calls and instinct, Maya did with satellite data, encrypted archives, and AI-driven pattern recognition. But the fire was the same, and like Riley, Maya didn't care about the noise. She cared about the names. One evening, alone in her office after 22 hours straight of testimony preparation, Maya took off her glasses and stared at Riley's portrait on the wall. "I don't know if I'm doing this right," she whispered. No answer came, of course, but outside her office, she heard the buzz of team members working late, reviewing files, writing appeals, making calls to soldiers who were hanging by a thread. That was the answer. Legacy doesn't echo back in words, it echoes in footsteps. And Maya kept walking. Years later, at the 150th anniversary gala of Valor and Truth, the last surviving member of Riley's original legal team stood at the podium. An old man now, but his voice still carried the weight of the courtroom. "They tried to reduce her to a file," he said, "to a footnote, to a failed officer, and instead they built 100 years of justice in her name." He lifted his glass. "To Captain Monroe?" The crowd responded in one voice. "To Riley." And far away, in the quiet of a Montana field, where her ashes had been scattered under an old pine tree, the wind whispered through the grass, soft, certain, unyielding, just like her. As the world entered a new era, space-faring AI-governed, borders blurred by digital governance and shifting alliances, some things still held. One of them was Riley Monroe's legacy. 200 years after her first tribunal, a spacecraft named the Monroe launched from Earth orbit. It wasn't a warship, it wasn't even military. It was a mobile truth archival vessel, the first of its kind, commissioned by an intergovernmental body designed to monitor and document international and interplanetary human rights actions, especially those involving military or paramilitary institutions. On its side, painted boldly in white, "Truth never needed permission." Inside the Monroe digital archives held the complete case history of every overturned military discharge on record, available in over 90 languages. But in the heart of the ship, in a quiet, climate-controlled chamber, was one artifact, only one. Riley Monroe's original discharge papers. They weren't shown in glass, they weren't projected holographically. They were stored in a small titanium box with a handwritten note mounted above them. This is where we began. May it always remind us how far silence can fall and how high justice must rise to reach it. It was tradition that every officer assigned to the Monroe, whether commander, archivist, AI ethicist, or cadet, would spend 1 hour in that room alone before starting their rotation. They would be required to read Riley's letter to the one who comes next. Then they would add one sentence to the digital Monroe log. Thousands of such entries filled the archive now, some simple, "I will listen," some resolute, "No one falls quietly on my watch," and some eerily reminiscent of the fire Riley had once lit with only her voice, "If truth is oxygen, then I'm ready to burn." Back on Earth in the original Chicago headquarters, now preserved as a living museum, visitors walked through immersive exhibits telling not just Riley's story, but those of everyone who followed her. Each section ended with a door. On the other side of every door, a small booth waited. Inside, a phone. Just like the rotary one Riley used that day at the diner. There was no line, no connection, no recording. But people still picked it up. Every day, a father who had lost a son to silence. A young recruit unsure if they had the strength to blow the whistle. A veteran who still woke up sweating from both combat and courtroom trials. A child just learning what integrity meant. They all picked up the phone and said it. "Son, now." Because Riley Monroe hadn't just changed military law, she hadn't just rescued reputations or restored medals or exposed corruption. She had proven a single truth that now outlived buildings, commands, and centuries. That one person with a voice, a spine, and a cause could not only rewrite a verdict, they could rewrite the future. And so they did. Every year, every name, every time. And long after uniforms turned to relics and empires turned to stories, the truth still marched, wearing no rank, bearing no flag, but speaking always in her voice. And somewhere, deep in the silence of space aboard the Monroe, far beyond Earth's gravity, a soft chime echoed through the archival chamber. A new case had arrived, not from a battlefield, not from a courtroom. From a mining colony orbiting Ganymede, where a private security force had expelled a former military engineer after she exposed failures in the colony's oxygen recycling systems. They'd labeled her unstable, unreliable, dishonorably terminated. And now she was requesting help. It would have been easy to dismiss, too far, too minor, too late. But on the Monroe, no distance was too great, no claim too small, and no silence too deep. A young officer named Lieutenant Keiko Velez, born generations after Riley Monroe's final stand, received the alert. She stood, adjusted her posture, and entered the chamber. Before beginning the casework, she walked to the titanium box at the center of the room. Placing her palm on the console beside it, she activated the voice playback. Riley's voice, preserved for over 2 centuries, filled the chamber. If they've buried it, dig. If they've denied it, demand it. And if they've called it dishonor, remember who gave them the right to define it. Remind them who really holds the truth. Keiko nodded, heart steady, and opened the file. Down on Earth, a new museum exhibit opened in the Monroe Foundation's planetary headquarters. No longer a single building, but a network of outposts linked across cities, countries, even orbital stations. The new exhibit was called The Unbroken Chain. It featured a single line of holograms, representing every person whose life had been altered because Riley stood up in that courtroom and said, "I was wrongfully discharged." Over 1.2 million names. Veterans, medics, engineers, linguists, drone pilots, whistleblowers, lawyers, technicians, recruits, even civilians who had been caught in the shadow of institutional failure. Each hologram blinked slowly, alive. Not lost to time, not silenced, remembered. In the center of the room stood a sphere of light. Within it, projected eternally, was Riley's face, not solemn, not commanding, smiling just slightly, just enough to say, "You've got this." And in the center of the room, etched into the floor where every visitor had to walk, were the final words Riley ever wrote, discovered only decades after her passing, in a sealed journal beneath the floorboards of her Montana cabin. They read, "Truth doesn't die. It waits, and when it's found again, it doesn't whisper, it roars. Be the roar." And all across the stars, in quiet rooms and echoing halls, on dusty colonies and marble courts, through transmission beams and encrypted files, in one voice, familiar and ancient, they answered, "We hear you, Captain." And still, they marched. 2 centuries and counting, and still the march had not stopped. In the year 2225, the Monroe Tribunal system was ratified by the Interstellar Coalition, a united body of Earth and its off-world colonies. Under this new system, no military discharge on any human settlement, whether landlocked, airborne, or orbiting a distant planet, could be finalized without first being reviewed by a Monroe board. Each board consisted of 3 elements: a legal representative, a psychological advocate, and a citizen historian, individuals trained not only in law and ethics, but in the cultural and personal consequences of military silence. This new process was complex, often slow, and at times controversial. But the ruling class knew better than to resist. Riley Monroe's name had become untouchable, not because it was canonized, but because it belonged to the people. To try to erase her now would be to erase truth itself. In the first year of the tribunal system, over 40,000 cases were reopened. Most were older than anyone still living, but data didn't die, and neither did injustice. The tribunal didn't just correct records, it restored dignity publicly and formally. Names that had once lived in the shadows of shame were now being projected onto monument walls across Earth and the colonies, followed by a single phrase, "Cleared by truth." On Mars, a permanent monument stood at the entrance to the largest military rehabilitation compound. It was not tall. It wasn't even raised off the ground. It was a trench, 10 meters long, 1 meter deep, filled with thousands of unpolished dog tags, untouched and undisturbed. Soldiers, veterans, and civilians alike came to walk the edge of it. Some dropped their own tags in, others retrieved one and brought it to the nearby center to begin a review. At the head of the trench was a plaque. It read, "This is where the silence ends." Across space aboard the Monroe, Lieutenant Velez continued her work on the Ganymede case. The young engineer Ada Endure had been living in a darkened utility tunnel cut off from credits, oxygen rations, and transport access. She'd been painted as unstable, delusional, just another discharged voice meant to disappear. But Riley's system didn't allow voices to disappear. Velez transmitted the case back to Earth, and within 48 hours, a full Monroe board had convened. 2 days later, Ada was evacuated from the colony. A week after that, her discharge was reversed. A formal apology issued. The colony administration restructured. Ada didn't become famous. She didn't want to be. But one night, back on Earth, she visited the Monroe exhibit in Chicago. She waited until the hall was empty. Then she sat beside the original bench statue of Riley, looked at the still expression cast in metal, and whispered, "Thank you." She placed her old ID badge at Riley's feet. Then she stood. Behind her, a young student walked up and sat down next to the statue. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just watched her leave and picked up where she left off. In the decades that followed, Monroe centers were established on over 40 planets and space stations. Each bore the same symbol, not a gavel, not a gun, not a flag. A hand, outstretched, holding a single dog tag. The hand symbol wasn't explained in literature. It didn't need to be. It meant, "I hear you." In the future, when communication moved beyond words through neural links, visual pulse data, and bioreactive memory threads, Riley's voice still echoed. Her original statements were encoded in every truth protocol, her testimony converted into billions of linguistic variations. And yet, even in the height of advancement, her oldest quote remained the most cited in every legal training, every military ethics class, every tribunal. I didn't need to be believed by everyone. I only needed to be right once. It became the battle cry for whistleblowers, for soldiers pushed out because they questioned, for officers discharged because they protected instead of obeyed, for doctors who refused to falsify reports, for code breakers who warned of war, for cadets who disobeyed orders to save a life. Each time a truth emerged, someone said it. And with each voice, Riley Monroe marched again, in data, in memory, in code, in blood, because a discharge might end a career. But it would never again end a story, not if Riley had anything to say about it, and she always would. In the year 2300, with humanity now scattered across dozens of planets, moons, and artificial habitats, the word discharge no longer meant what it used to, not because war had vanished, conflict still burned in pockets of the stars, but because of what came after, because of what Riley Monroe had built, and what generations had preserved, refined, and defended like holy ground. The Monroe Protocol was now integrated into every military enlistment form in the human sphere. Before a soldier swore allegiance to their nation, fleet, or planetary defense agency, they read 10 lines. If I am punished for protecting life, if I am silenced for telling the truth, if I am dishonored for refusing to obey injustice, then my discharge shall not be final. Then my name shall not be forgotten. Then my story shall be heard by those who came before me, by Monroe, by truth, by legacy. The lines were not just formality, they were law. Even artificial officers, cybernetic minds designed for legal analysis, were hard-coded with Monroe ethics. And still, at the heart of every review, every hearing, every appeal, there remained one human requirement. Someone had to listen. No machine, no code, no law could replace that. So people listened. They trained to listen. They devoted their lives to it. These listeners were known as echoes, a new rank created for those who dedicated themselves to preserving and acting upon the voices of the wrongly cast out. Each echo took a pledge not to enforce, but to remember. They wore no uniform, only a single emblem, an ear carved into metal, wrapped in the shape of a rising flame. At the Echo Academy on Europa Station, recruits studied every Monroe tribunal from Earth's past, memorizing decisions, arguments, reversals, and reforms. Riley's first hearing, once held in a quiet civilian courtroom, was now simulated in near-perfect immersive detail for new cadets. In that simulation, a digital Riley stood once more, speaking calmly, clearly, undeniably. Her voice cut through time, through all the voices that had come after her, and landed like steel in the hearts of those still learning how to fight. I don't need your favor, I need the truth, and it's already mine. When the simulation ended, cadets stood for a moment of silence, not for Riley, but for themselves, in recognition of what they were preparing to carry. And they carried it far. By now the wall of the redeemed had grown beyond a single location. Holographic walls appeared at every Monroe Center across the galaxy. The names refreshed live, glowing for 30 seconds as each new record was cleared. Some of the names didn't even belong to humans anymore. The Monroe Doctrine had been adopted by several alien ally species whose own systems of justice had recognized the power of the human mechanism for redemption. In a small outpost orbiting Kepler 62F, a young soldier named Kellen of the Rethan, a reptilian species allied with Earth, stood before a tribunal. They had been exiled for warning civilians before a corporate strike authorized by a multi-species security coalition, branded disloyal, dangerous, dishonorable, but Kellen, clutching a translated copy of Dishonorably Discharged, until they fought back, invoked the Monroe right. "I request echo review," they hissed in their native tongue. A transmission arrived within minutes, a response. "We hear you." The tribunal shifted, Kellen was restored, the strike was suspended, and the Rython adopted a parallel version of the Monroe Protocol within the year. Riley's reach now spanned systems, cultures, species. Her words, translated into over 300 known dialects, were etched into the central spine of the Galactic Legal Codex. Where silence was forced, truth will shout. Where shame was planted, honor will rise. Where justice was denied, I will walk back in. Not alone, never alone. Still, every year on the date of her tribunal victory, something extraordinary happened. Not by law, not by ritual, by choice. At exactly 1200 Universal Time, all Monroe centers went silent. No alerts, no trials, no appeals, just silence. For 1 full minute. And in that silence, one recording played, galaxy-wide, the sound of a rotary phone being picked up. A breath. And then, "Son, now." Riley Monroe had never commanded fleets. She had never held the highest rank. She hadn't even retired with a pension, but she'd spoken one truth in a courtroom no one believed would listen, and 2 centuries later, the galaxy still stood up when her name was spoken, still listened when others couldn't speak, still marched, even in zero gravity, even in foreign skies, even in courts made of light and sound. Because honor didn't come from medals. It came from fighting for those who had been denied them, and that fight, it was eternal. It was hers, and it was ours. On the 300th anniversary of Riley Monroe's tribunal, the one that changed not just her life but the fate of justice itself, the galaxy came to a pause. Across the planets, moons, orbitals, and deep space habitats of the Terran Interstellar Accord, the day was recognized not as a holiday of flags or fireworks, but of reflection. It was called Echo Day. And on Echo Day, the world did not celebrate a victory, it honored a vow. On Mars, in the shadow of Olympus Mons, a monument of glass rose from the red soil, not built to tower, but to resonate. The glass was embedded with nanoliths that responded to the voice of any visitor. Speak a name, any name cleared by the Monroe Tribunal system, and the monument shimmered, illuminating that soldier's story in holographic light across the Martian dusk. On Titan, beneath the methane haze, survivors of failed military experiments laid their hands on a glowing wall, one that recorded the names of their fallen. Names Riley had never known, but whose freedom she had nonetheless earned. In the Oort cloud aboard a mining vessel turned floating legal outpost, a single page, the page, Riley's letter, to the one who comes next, was printed in gold leaf microprint, readable only under ultraviolet. It was mounted above the vessel's tribunal chamber, a reminder that justice doesn't scale, it starts in one breath, one voice, one choice. And far from Earth, orbiting a quiet exoplanet once thought uninhabitable, was the final monument. No metal, no statue, no name, just a garden, grown in complete silence. Cultivated from Earth flora once thought extinct, lavender, rosemary, white pine, wild chamomile. The scent was engineered to match the air from the Montana forest where Riley Monroe had spent her final years. This garden could not be entered, only observed. Every visitor was required to sit alone for 1 hour, no tech, no transmission, no speaking. And yet, within those gardens, thousands found peace. Thousands remembered their own silence, and how Riley Monroe had turned her silence into a sword. And on this 300th Echo Day, the galaxy prepared for the lighting of the archive flame, an ancient symbol now digitized and coded to awaken for only one reason: when a new voice refuses to be silenced. Every year, it flickered thousands of times. This year, it roared to life 11,273 times in a single cycle. And when it lit, across every Monroe Center and every colony, every ship and tribunal, Riley's voice played once again, Not the one from her speech, not the one from the courtroom, the one that started it all. The sound of an old rotary phone dialing. The breath. The steel in her voice as she said, "Son, now." And across the stars, across the centuries, across the thousands who now stood because she once refused to sit down, the response echoed back, no longer in secret, no longer alone. Now we march. Because Monroe was not just a name anymore, she was a system, a code, a spark in the data, and she lived wherever the truth refused to stay buried. They once called her dishonorably discharged. Now she was the foundation of justice itself. And justice like her would never, never be silent again. At the edge of known space, beyond the mapped galaxies, past the final Terran beacons, in a lonely corridor of black, where the stars were quiet and time moved like breath held too long, a signal pulsed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't urgent, but it was unmistakable. A Monroe Protocol beacon. The station that detected it was an old relay, mostly obsolete, but it had been built during the first wave of galactic expansion, and like all things constructed in the name of truth, it had never stopped listening, even when funding was cut, even when governments changed, even when names were forgotten. The signal carried one file, text only, encrypted. It took 7 minutes to unlock, even for the latest AI systems. The message read, "I was discharged before my world collapsed. I reported the abandonment of civilians. My commanding officer destroyed the logs and left them behind. I survived. They didn't. If truth still matters out here, find me. GTL Arden, Unit 14ZX, Crucible Station, lost contact year 2178. Silence followed. The Crucible Station, long thought destroyed, declared a catastrophic failure due to solar instability, assumed no survivors. And yet this signal had been sent just days ago. Valor and Truth, now run by a distributed interplanetary network of autonomous legal agents and living human judges, responded immediately. A case file was opened. A task force was assembled. But this one was different. Because Crucible Station wasn't just a lost outpost. It was the final known location of the last unopened Monroe lockbox. One of 5 she'd prepared during her final year in Montana. 4 had been discovered. Each had contained notes, evidence, tools, a blueprint for expanding justice into the system she could never reach herself. But the 5th? Unknown, unopened, unfound. Until now. Aboard the V&T flagship Concordance, Captain Maya Kinsley's great-granddaughter, Echo Commander Jalen Kinsley, read the alert in silence. Her eyes lingered on the name L. Arden. And then, without hesitation, she activated the ship-wide announcement. All hands, prepare for emergency traversal. We're going dark to the Crucible. No one questioned it, not because she had rank, because she carried the same voice, the same fire, the same inheritance. On Earth, the flame of the archive pulsed brighter than it had in over a decade. And from the original Monroe bench in Chicago, preserved, still warm from the sun, a visitor picked up the phone. They didn't say anything for a moment. Then quietly, fiercely, they whispered, "You're not lost. We're coming." Across the ship, as the Concordance vanished into deep space, one phrase lit up in every Monroe center, from Earth to Europa, from Titan to Kepler, from Mars to moons not yet named. A phrase not programmed, but spontaneous. A phrase carried forward in every soldier, every student, every soul who ever stood on Riley Monroe's shoulders. No truth left behind. And somewhere, in a dead system blinking slowly back to life, a lone survivor sat inside the dark, clutching a worn military badge, a torn letter, and a prayer no one had answered in 122 years, until now. Because no matter how far injustice ran, Riley Monroe would still find it. And the march, it would never stop, not as long as someone still reached for that phone, not as long as someone still answered. They arrived in the Crucible system like a storm, swallowed by silence. The Concordance dropped from quantum slipspace just outside the orbit of what used to be Crucible Station, an experimental military-civilian hybrid outpost built on the rim of the dying star Veil Sigma 3. Official records said the station collapsed into its own orbital decay in 2178. No distress calls, no survivors, no remains. But the signal from Sergeant L. Arden had been real. Time-stamped? Confirmed. Routed through an ancient emergency frequency only embedded into the earliest versions of the Monroe Protocol. A failsafe buried so deep in the system it could only be activated by someone who knew how Riley thought. The system was quiet. Too quiet. Then a flicker. One tiny light buried in the blackness, pulsing once every 12 seconds. 0-point echo signature confirmed, said the AI navigator. Beacon source, crucible shell, life signs. Faint, distorted. Commander Jalen Kinsley leaned forward, eyes locked. "Bring us in. Keep the Monroe Channel open." As they approached it, the wreck of Crucible Station came into view, drifting in pieces like bones from a long-dead beast. Hulls split, tunnels collapsed, solar shielding scorched into oblivion. But one section remained intact. A lower deck. And in that deck, heat signatures. The Concordance launched a shuttle with a full Monroe Echo unit. No weapons drawn, just scanners, medgear, and legal warrants encoded in bio-ink beneath their skin. Inside, amid rubble and stale air, they found her, Sergeant Arden. She was older than expected, malnourished, wrapped in layers of synthetic cloth and clutching a makeshift terminal that had somehow kept her alive by rerouting power from forgotten subgrids. Beside her sat a metal case, old, worn, stamped with a faded emblem, RM-05, the fifth lockbox. Arden looked up at them, blinking against the shuttle lights. "I didn't think anyone would come," she whispered. Jalen knelt beside her. "We always come," she said. "You're not forgotten." Arden's hand trembled as she slid the case forward. "I don't know what's in it, but she left it for us. She said, if the truth ever got too far from Earth, someone would have to carry the flame." They brought her aboard the shuttle. Medics stabilized her. The lockbox was sealed in a containment unit, untouched until Echo Tribunal review, but Jalen Kinsley didn't wait. Back aboard the Concordance, surrounded by her team, she opened the final box. It wasn't tech. It wasn't data. It was a notebook, handwritten. Pages filled with names, incidents, maps, commands, everyone marked classified, never cleared. Dozens of cases Riley had tracked but never lived to resolve. Records lost in collapsed systems, erased from archives, purged from official logs, but now they were found. The final page held one last note. In Riley's own hand, "If you're reading this, I failed to finish what I started. That means you have to. These stories don't have endings, only echoes. Find them, fight for them, free them, and when they ask who sent you, say my name, then say yours. And tell them, we're not marching for medals. We're marching so no one walks alone again." Jalen closed the notebook. In silence, she placed it in the ship's central archive, digitized it, distributed it to every Monroe center across the galaxy. One by one, systems lit up with alerts, cases reopening, stories returning. And everywhere, on every station, every outpost, every distant moon where a soldier once believed they'd been forgotten. They saw the same message flash across the nearest screen. Case reactivated by order of the Monroe Flame. Status, not closed. Status, never closed. Back on Earth, the original Monroe Memorial Bench, long since converted into a living memory interface, vibrated gently as the signal from Crucible reached it. A child sitting beside the statue looked up at her mother, confused. "What's that?" Her mother smiled softly, voice thick with pride. "That's someone coming home." And above them, in the stars, the march continued, not loud, not fast, but steady, unstoppable, eternal.